aggressive India in South Asia, India-Pakistan tension, or the formation of new alliances, all these developments have the potential to disturb the existing political, economic, and military balance. The great power rivalry and competition and the significant challenges they pose for global economic, political, and strategic stability underscore the importance of developing mechanisms to avoid confrontation and peacefully manage global competition. This session will review these challenges, assess their implications, and make recommendations for the way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to discuss the existing international environment challenges and opportunities, we have an outstanding panel comprising of Ambassador Robin Riffel, Professor Dr. Yan Shutong, and Ambassador Riaz Muhammad Khan. Each speaker will share their perspective on the important issues for 15 minutes, which will be followed by an interactive question-answer session. Our first speaker for this session is Ambassador Robin Riffel. Ambassador Robin Riffel is one of the most prominent faces in Pakistan and South Asia. She served for almost 40 years in important positions in the administration, including in the Department of State, USAID, Department of Defense, and many other think tanks. She was the first Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, Ambassador to Tunisia, Vice President of the National Defense University, and Deputy Special Inspector General for Iraq reconstruction. Her contribution to building a strong Pakistan-US relations are well known. Ambassador Riffel will speak on the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Ambassador Riffel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be back in Pakistan for this conference, and I want to thank Cass and particularly my old friend Ambassador Jalani for inviting me. And I'm particularly pleased to share the stage with one of Pakistan's most distinguished and wisest diplomats, Riaz Muhammad Khan. So I'm really pleased to start off this section. My job is to share the U.S. perspective on the emerging international security environment, and most specifically on the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. I expect you're all familiar with the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy that was launched last February of this year. This strategy is in recognition of the fact that Indo-Pacific is the most dynamic region in the world. It's an economic powerhouse with the potential to affect the future of people everywhere over the next century. So the U.S. goal is to restore American leadership in the Indo-Pacific and to adapt it to the 21st century. This means modernizing long-standing bilateral alliances with countries like Australia, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, re-energizing the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India relationship, strengthening the US relationship with ASEAN, and also building up emerging partnerships with countries like India and the Pacific Islands. The US aims to forge innovative, flexible links between these partnerships in order to meet the urgent challenges we face. On the one hand, competition with China, but on the other hand, global concerns on climate and pandemics. The U.S. vision for the Indo-Pacific is a free and open, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient area. This means that the seas and skies are governed by international law, and that the rules everyone agrees to abide by are seen as fair. This means building collective capacity for action within the region. It also requires forging connections between the Indo-Pacific in the east and the Euro-Atlantic in the west in order to leverage European interests in the region. This is part of the motivation for AUKUS, the new Australia-UK-US partnership. To make this vision a reality, of course, the U.S. needs to extend and modernize its defense presence in the region and to enhance interoperability with alliance and other partners there. It needs to expand its diplomatic presence to be able to promote U.S. values, but also engage in important issues like climate change, pandemics, and reducing regional vulnerability to these global challenges. It also means that we need to expand our economic engagement through a new Indo-Pacific economic framework. In Tokyo this past May, President Biden launched this Indo-Pacific economic framework for prosperity with a dozen initial partners: Australia, Brunei, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, 14 altogether. And together these countries represent 40% of the world's GDP. So the IPEF will focus on regulating the digital economy, on promoting clean energy and secure supply chains, and promoting transparency and anti-corruption. Okay, where's number 4? I have lost my... While this strategy is clearly aimed at countering China's rise, the references in the strategy are somewhat muted. The strategy document itself refers to competition with China and states that regional governments need to make their own choices. By that, we mean that the regional states should not be coerced by China, but at the same time, the U.S. shouldn't be forcing countries to choose between the United States and China. The strategy also calls for investing in democratic institutions and civil society, for improving transparency, for promoting free trade, and of course, maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. All of these activities suggest a coordinated effort to promote standards which are not exactly currently part of China's playbook. There has been concern that the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, which was launched before the congressionally mandated national security strategy, would not be consistent, that these two strategies wouldn't be consistent. The Biden administration released this national security document in March, an interim document in March of 2021, but the full-blown national security strategy wasn't released until about a week ago. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan launched that strategy in a speech at Georgetown University, which I expect some of you actually watched online. The strategy was delayed because it was clear late last year that Russia was likely to invade Ukraine, and the Biden National Security Team was concerned that it was best to see how events unfolded before committing to a way forward. As it turns out, and I think not unsurprisingly, the Indo-Pacific strategy is consistent with the new national security strategy. That strategy asserts that in the coming decade, it will be a decisive time in determining the global future for the next century. It prioritizes outcompeting China, constraining Russia, as well as grappling with the global challenges like climate and pandemics. The mantra in this strategy is invest, align, and compete. invest at home in the underlying tools of American influence and strength, including industry, infrastructure, intelligence, a modern military, and so on, aligning our goals and approaches to global problems and with those of like-minded partners, and competing effectively with China and others who wish to write the rules of the road for the next century in a way that favors authoritarian systems over democratic systems. This means helping countries that China is courting to solve their problems rather than forcing them to choose between China and the West. Interestingly, the strategy document refers to China as the People's Republic of China, as the PRC. This was a deliberate attempt to separate the Chinese people from the Chinese government. It also states categorically that the US will deal with any country, regardless of ideology or political structure, that wants to uphold a rules-based order and tackle global challenges. Of course, the drive to focus on the Indo-Pacific did not start with the Biden administration or even the Obama pivot to Asia. Let me just quickly review the history. Geographers and geodeterminists in the early 20th century pointed out the dangers of a single power dominating the Euro-Asian landmass, from which it could shape the politics and economy of the rest of the world to the disadvantage of the US and Western Europe, which were really part of the periphery. By the 2000s, it was clear that the hope in the 1970s that including China in the global economic framework would moderate its authoritarian politics was not panning out. Given this reality, the US undertook a substantial military, diplomatic, and economic reorientation towards Asia, starting with the Bush administration in the mid-2000s. The aim of that reorientation was not so much to contain China's rise, which was not so apparent at the time. Rather, the US sought to manage China's growth through a blend of internal and external balancing, combined with expanded engagement with China. These actions were intended to work together to expand the combined power of the United States and its allies and partners in Asia to dissuade China from bidding for hegemony. The idea was to preserve the existing power balance in the region, in which the US at that time held a superior position. The Obama pivot to Asia essentially carried out the initiative started by President Bush: the G20, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Strategic Partnership with India, and Pacific Command force posture changes. Obama also established a framework for engagement with Southeast Asia, where diplomacy had been episodic since the Vietnam War, and we now have regular US-ASEAN summits. Relations with China deteriorated under Obama, largely because Xi turned out to be a far tougher counterpart than his more mild-mannered predecessor. Obama started out favoring diplomacy and pledging to respect China's core interests, but later found that he needed to take a tougher line. Unfortunately, Obama delayed taking the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement to the Congress for domestic political reasons, really, and as a result, this important initiative was lost. The Trump administration was the first to formally use the term Indo-Pacific as opposed to Asia-Pacific when they rolled out the free and open Indo-Pacific concept in 2017. They adopted this term from Japanese Prime Minister Abe, who believed it connotated a more expansive region encompassing all of the Indian Ocean, including the Persian Gulf. It was also meant to give a nod to India and encourage India's cooperation in plans to counter China. The Trump approach was quite consistent with the previous administration in confirming Asia's importance in US foreign policy. The problem, however, was that it did not have a trade element. It walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And President Trump's threat-centric protectionist rhetoric and his reluctance to promote human rights implied that the United States was walking away from what had made American leadership so distinct, That is, an emphasis on promoting collective goods rather than pursuing narrow unilateral aims. I cited this background briefly just to demonstrate that the current Indo-Pacific strategy is really part of a continuity in efforts we've been making over time. So there's no great changes that have occurred over the last couple of decades. Now I'd just like to take a few moments to talk about challenges to this strategy. The strategy is logical, it's compelling in that it builds on the recognition of the importance of Asia that previous administrations have also talked about, and it focuses on strengthening alliances and working collectively to bring greater security and prosperity to the region. But effective implementation is going to be challenging. The demands of strategic competition with China will require a major concentration of American resources, diplomatic, economic, and military, in the Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, efforts to build a stable and predictable relationship with Russia, and the Iran nuclear deal were all aimed to free up U.S. resources for the Indo-Pacific. Unfortunately, Russia's invasion of Ukraine have upended that strategic calculus. So the resources, the challenge of resources is bound to intensify in the coming years. The strategy has very expansive ambitions, vowing to focus on every corner of the region, from Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania, including the Pacific Islands. Senior U.S. officials have rushed off recently to the Pacific Islands to demonstrate this commitment. But at the end of the day, if everything's a priority, then nothing is a priority. So that's one of the challenges for the strategy. The strategy also contains some perennial contradictions. The pursuit of U.S. interests does not necessarily neatly align with the promotion of American values. The Indo-Pacific's political landscape is diverse, ranging from liberal democracies to authoritarian and hybrid regimes. Some key countries, including India, are unlikely to embrace a democratic values-based foreign policy. Southeast Asia's deafening silence on Beijing's repression of Uyghurs attests to the limited regional support for human rights and democracy promotion. So the U.S. probably needs to consider more pragmatic language like a secure and prosperous region rather than a democratic region, which aligns better with the interests and perspectives of most of the Indo-Pacific countries. The U.S. cannot build a new regional economic framework without new trade agreements. In a region where many countries value economic cooperation more than traditional security cooperation, and countries count China as their largest trading partner, the U.S. needs to make an economic policy a linchpin of the Indo-Pacific strategy. This will require managing long-standing domestic concerns about the disadvantages of trade agreements for U.S. workers. I would add that another problem in the economic framework is that Pakistan, a democracy of 220 million people, clearly situated in the Indian Ocean, is not included in this economic strategy, and I believe this is an omission that really needs to be remedied. Some argue that the U.S. strategy and economic interests would be best served simply by returning to a revised Trans-Pacific Partnership or applying to join its successor, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which China has already applied for membership in. But the administration says, has a different view. They are downplaying the importance of free trade deals. They argue that countries today are less concerned about market access and more concerned about secure supply chains, international financial institutions which focus on global public goods, investment, technology transfer, help with transition to green energy technologies, and overall fairness in the global economy. This is logical on the one hand, but at the end of the day, I expect that market access and free trade agreements are still a priority for many countries in the region. The document advances a collective balancing strategy in which like-minded countries pull together to defend their common interests and deter military aggression. This seems like common sense, but U.S. allies and partners, like the U.S., have limited military capabilities to bolster deterrence, and they might not be willing to enhance these capabilities, especially given Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some have suggested that a more realistic statement of U.S. strategic objectives may require that we actually rethink the Indo-Pacific geographic formulation and narrow America's regional focus to East Asia and the Pacific. That is, prioritizing the areas of competition that matter most to U.S. national security interests. This is consistent with the view of a number of military experts who argue that the Western Pacific and helping Taiwan prepare for a potential military move by China is the key challenge. That, of course, would be a bit awkward given the fanfare with which we've launched the new Indo-Pacific strategy. In terms of implications for international security, the goal of this Indo-Pacific strategy is to enhance global security by creating a stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Whether it achieves that goal depends on whether and how it's implemented. The obvious concern is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will cause the U.S. to prioritize countering the present threat posed by Russia over the longer-term threat of Chinese dominance. This is sort of like the challenge that Obama faced when he wanted to pivot to Asia but was drawn back into the Middle East wars. However, I think Russia's ineffectiveness on the battlefield, paired with the increasing investments other European nations are making as a result of that invasion, make the possibility of a U.S. pivot to Asia more likely. And I think the U.S. knows that if it sacrifices this pivot to Asia, that China will likely take advantage of the opening to increase its influence in the region and promote its own global security policy. A related concern is that over time the strategy, if rigorously implemented, might have the opposite of the intended effect. Rather than deterring China, it might actually provoke China. And I think that the less provocative rhetoric in the strategy is designed to avoid this outcome. Finally, it's important to realize for the U.S., the challenge posed by China is far more complex than the one the U.S. faced when it squared off against the Soviet Union. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is an economic powerhouse, one that is integrated into the global economy and enmeshed in nearly every global supply chain. So contrary to the later stages of the Cold War, where there were well-defined spheres of influence and modus vivendi between the two principal protagonists, these conditions are not present today, and the U.S. needs to be aware of that. So the bottom line is that the Indo-Pacific strategy provides an opportunity for a stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region that would allow all countries, including China, to grow and prosper. And in this sense, it could be a modest corrective to President Alvey's very comprehensive exposition of the ways in which the world seems to be spinning out of control because of both technology and human passions and the fact that nation-states have failed to meet the expectations of their citizens. But I think if carefully managed and implemented, this strategy really could promote global security writ large and allow the U.S. and other countries to live in a better and safer world. I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Robin Riffel, for your excellent remarks. It is reassuring to learn that while advancing its Indo-Pacific strategy, the United States of America will not force countries to choose sides, because this remains a major concern in South Asia and other Asia-Pacific countries, because in many of the countries there was a perception that this confrontation or competition may not reach a stage when they would be confronted with a choice of either with us or against us. So from that point of view, it's very, very reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, our second speaker for this session is Professor Dr. Yan Chiu-tong. Dr. Chiu-tong is a distinguished professor of Tsinghua University, where he is serving as Dean of the Institute of International Relations. He is also a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and Secretary General of the World Peace Forum. Dr. Chiu-tong obtained his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and was named as one of the world's top 100 public intellectuals by the American journal Foreign Policy in 2008. He is the only Chinese political scientist listed in most cited Chinese researchers. He is an author of several books, and his books have been translated in English, Japanese, Korean, Hindi, Farsi, and Albanian. Dr. Chiu-tong will share his perspective on China's vision for regional peace and security. The floor is yours, sir.
Gilani. And this is a great pleasure to attend your forum. And I highly appreciate this opportunity and to share my view with the distinguished guests. First, I want to say I'm not qualified to be any speaker for China's foreign policy. I'm just a professor, ordinary citizen, and I have no official background. So my view may not represent the government policy. I only can share with you my personal understanding about Chinese foreign policy. And today, I was given a topic as China's vision for regional peace and security in the evolving geostrategic environment. So I will focus on this topic. And personally, I suppose the post-Cold War has been over. Now we're moving into a new age. So the world is moving a new international order. Unfortunately, this order is not making progress from the previous one, but it has a retrogressive order. That means the history is set back. And the main feature of the coming world order, or the current existing order, is uncertainty. The uncertainty is represented by few phenomena, such as strategic confrontation between China and the US. Just now we heard this from Ambassador Rachel, and also we heard the previous speakers talking about the China-US competition, and also including the deglobalization and including economic sanctions and technology decouplings, and also include digital technology competition, and certainly also mainly between China and the US. And the war between Russia and the West also is an important factor shaping the current order. And the last element I'm thinking about, maybe not the last one, and is the arms race between many rival countries. And so I certainly want to talking about the strategic competition between China and the US. I think this competition is getting worse in the next decade. And both China and the United States mutually recognize China-US relationship the most important bilateral relationship in the world, because it's do not only have an impact on the US and China, but also have the influence on almost everyone on the earth. And currently, both of them have mutually defined the other side as the biggest challenge to the current world order. They use an even more unpleasant term to describe the other side. And the US government has clearly stated it has already adopted small yard, high fence strategy to contain China. That's their policy. So this small yard, high fence strategy inevitably will turn into an all-round confrontation between China and the US in terms of military, trade, technology, finance, diplomacy, media, ideology, and so on. And from a Chinese perspective, and the Chinese think it is unfair for the US to be the only dominating power in the world forever. And the US never keep it a secret from seeing, and the US want to maintain its hegemony and as the only leading power in the world. And the Chinese, with a large population, 4 times larger than the US, and the Chinese cannot understand why, and we do not have the right to be a strong power as strong as the United States. So from the Chinese perspective, and the US have a wrong will or the wrong goal to prevent China from being strong as the United States. So my personal understanding, this is zero sum between China and the US. When China wants to be as strong as the US, and the US want to prevent China from being as strong as the US, so the zero-sum game becomes very difficult. And in that way, I will say their competition do not only have a negative impact on the relationship between them, but also have a very, very unhealthy impact on the third parties. And those countries at this moment, from my understanding, and prefer a hedging strategy between China and the US. But this strategy and cannot avoid the pressure from the competition between China and the US, which is requiring these countries taking sides. Just now, Ambassador Ruff has already said, US do not want to force the third parties to take sides and with the US. From my understanding, China do the same. China never require anyone to take sides with China during the competition with the US. But the competition itself will inevitably impose that kind of pressure on third parties. So I think China-US competition is the key factor and for shaping the coming world order. And the deglobalization, because China and because the U.S. adopted this small yard, high fence strategy, so definitely U.S. will delink from China in many domains, and economy, trade, finance, military, and even education. And so, because these countries are delinked from each other, the deglobalization will become inevitable. So the globalization started from the end of the Cold War, stopped, and it was replaced by deglobalization, and as the main trend of the coming international politics. And the deglobalization actually started from the Brexit in 2016, when the UK withdrew from the EU. Then it was strengthened by the trade war against China initiated by the Trump administration in 2008. And then it is strengthened again by the COVID-19. And then it was strengthened further by the war in the Ukraine. And so you see, now we see more and more elements actually push the deglobalization forward rather than to reverse the deglobalization. So that's my personal view. The deglobalization very possibly becomes the main trend of the new order. So that's why I call the new order is a retrogressive order. And at this moment, because of the deglobalization, and make more and more countries, and even the industrialized countries, and even the EU develop the fear of the economic interdependence, and make the economic security and prevail in all major powers. And for the sake of economic security, and so major powers will prefer to develop their own independent supply chain. So this kind of a policy and will further driving deglobalization further. And even the EU and used to be the most strong supporter of globalization, now becoming hesitate to support globalization. And they have clearly stated EU is going to establish intra-supply chain within the EU members. So in the future, I think this deglobalization will not only and compose the traditional security to the many countries, but also will compose and non-traditional security problems to the many countries. And currently, the world moving into an age, we call it a digital age. And the deglobalization happened during the digital age. And in this age, digital competition between the major powers becomes very serious. At the beginning, we heard the head of the Aerospace Institution said that how much the digital technology has changed the content of national defense. Actually, digital technology not only changed the content of a war, changed the content of the defense, it changed almost every domain of the human life. And even in the education, you find that, and now we rely on the internet and very much for teaching classes. And currently, the digital technology creates a serious social uncertainty. And digital technology makes the social media available. And the social media actually is to make the rumors and the disinformation, fake information all around of us. So we are surrounded by this disinformation. And this disinformation forming and immediately and create a kind of a threat to the regime security, not only in developing countries and also in developed countries. And that's why now you find that more and more major powers of foreign policy is driven by their domestic concern for the regime security rather than for national interests or national security. So this kind of change make the uncertainty of international politics worse. And because the domestic security is less stable than national security, and when foreign policy mainly based on concern of the regime security and domestic interests, and the foreign policy will never be stable. And so make all of the major powers increase their suspicion of others' policy and reduce their confidence or trust in other announced policy. So that's why, from my understanding, the digital technology is making the world uncertain, make the world moving backward rather than moving forward. This is very unfortunate. So in the visible future, we will see the digital technology will make a quicker progress. And unfortunately, and the political system, political management, and the human being cannot manage this kind of uncertainty and well. And last, I have 2 minutes. I think this the war in Ukraine and cannot be finished in short term. That means the Russia and the West will go on the against each other and through the war for quite a long time. So this war will inevitably and have a negative impact on the current order, and it is very clear. And neither the Russian government or the Ukraine government and can offer the failure during the war. So when neither of them decided to give up the war and still want to resist there, the war cannot end it in short term. So the war do not only undermine the security order in Europe and also create a lot of negative impact on the security situation in Asia, like Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia and Central Asia and even South Asia. And the increase of the price and the food, energy, and the fertilizer, and not only the inflation, also it will bring, it has already caused a lot of broken of international supply chain. It will further to undermine this international supply chain. So will inevitably and increase economic uncertainty in Asia. I mean, these are 4 regions. Finally, I will say, and in general, I will argue, the world will witness the coming global order worse and worse, and it will be very difficult for us to turn the world back to 10 years ago. And the globalization has stopped. Deglobalization has become the main trend of the international order, and regional conflicts in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia will become more and more intensified. By now, we have not found any signs for major powers to cooperate with each other and to reduce the conflicts between them or effectively manage the competition between them. And so, I don't know how can we find the way to solve the problem, but we have to prepare for the unhealthy situation. And anyhow, I would agree with Ambassador Raffel that the competition between China and the US are very, very different from that between the US and the Soviet Union. It's not driven by ideology. It's not for expanding geographic occupation, and it's not aimed at change the other country's regime. This is a competition heavily focused on the technology, especially digital technology invention. So now this competition will make the new world order very different from what we're familiar with during the Cold War and the post-Cold War. So I hope and all of the countries, including China, Pakistan, and the US, and we can figure out what's the right way to manage the conflicts and to create a relatively stable world order for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Yan Shutong, for sharing your perspective on Chinese vision for regional peace and security. Ladies and gentlemen, our last speaker for this session is Ambassador Riaz Muhammad Khan, a rational, wise thinker on foreign policy and security issues. He's certainly is highly regarded not only in Pakistan but also all across the globe. Riaz Muhammad Khan Sahab has had a distinguished career in the Foreign Service of Pakistan. He served as Pakistan's Foreign Secretary, Ambassador of Pakistan to China, Ambassador of Pakistan to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union, and Ambassador of Pakistan to Kazakhstan. Ambassador Riaz Muhammad Khan authored a number of books, including Untying the Afghan Knot, Negotiating Soviet Withdrawal, and Afghanistan and Pakistan Conflict, Extremism, and Resistance to Modernity. Ambassador Riaz Muhammad Khan Sahab also served as Pakistan's envoy for back-channel diplomacy with India from 2009 to 2012. Prior to joining Pakistan's Foreign Service, Ambassador Riaz Muhammad Khan Sahab taught quantum physics at Punjab University. Ambassador Riaz Muhammad Khan Sahab will discuss US-China rivalry and options for Pakistan. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Air Marshal Farhat Hussain Khan Sahib, thank you very much for inviting me to this important conference. Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jilani, thank you very much for a very kind introduction of me. And Ambassador Robin Raffel, thank you for very kind sentiments you expressed for me. I must say that you are one of the most positive persons that I have come across in my diplomatic career. And in Pakistan, we greatly appreciate your efforts to build a cooperative relationship between our two countries. I have been asked to speak about US-China rivalry and options for Pakistan. I'll speak briefly on how I view US-China rivalry, what China and countries likely to be most affected need to bear in mind, and how should Pakistan steer its relations with the two great powers. The economic rise of China has been widely seen in the West, led by the United States, as a challenge to the long-established primacy of the West in global affairs. The argument suggests that the Chinese economy overtaking the US economy would disrupt world order. That another argument is that China's loans to developing countries would ensnare them into a debt trap and result in loss of sovereignty. So far, there is no instance where a country has gone broke under the weight of Chinese loans. Sri Lanka's financial crisis was caused by a combination of several factors, including depletion of remittances, collapse of tourism because of COVID, downturn in agriculture, flight of capital, etc. Anyway, debt is never forced on a recipient country which must itself avoid debt trap. An ideological twist is also given to the rivalry between the two competing systems of China and United States. The Western model of free market combined with liberal democracy and individual freedoms is dynamic, attracts global talent, and propels innovation and growth. The Chinese approach is described variously as state capitalism or free market with one-party political control. The Chinese call it Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics. Since the 1980s, this model has shown phenomenal efficiency in propelling targeted growth. The Chinese system is relatively closed, whereas China itself has hugely benefited from access it has to Western technology and scientific education. Some analysts believe that, like the Soviet communism of yesteryears, China offers an alternate model to the world and therefore a competitor, if not a threat to ideological primacy of the West. All this can be debated. First of all, the global influence of the West is underpinned by its military superiority. The United States continue to retain unmatched capacity to deploy its forces around the globe, regardless of setbacks in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, where the US attempted political engineering. Russia has shown a proclivity for military intervention. It did in Syria and now in Ukraine, but it is limited in scope. China has yet to demonstrate such military prowess. Its clashes with Vietnam 40 years ago and with India recently were essentially border skirmishes with a narrow context and purpose. Both materially and psychologically, China does not demonstrate inclination to use force except in relation to Taiwan and South China Sea islands, where it maintains sovereign claims. The West, in particular the United States, will do all it can to deny China access to advanced technology, to constrict China's R&D and manufacturing ability. But China has developed its own capacities in critical technologies, including artificial intelligence, space, and computer sciences. The pace of its advancement may slow down, but it cannot be stopped. China can also rely on its linkages in Asia Pacific and Europe, including Taiwan, which Taiwan, as you know, is the global manufacturing hub of computer chips, but it is not insular to China. In 2003, a Chinese minister told me that there were over 800,000 Taiwanese with residency living in Shanghai alone, and Taiwan then had $53 billion investment in mainland China. This guarantees technology flows between the two sides. Technology flows are often unstoppable when need combines with resources and capacity in terms of educational base. Countries will have to adjust to the different dimensions of US-China rivalry, which will become a constant feature in the new global environment. Era of globalization with promotion of free trade and flow of knowledge appears to be closing. The important question is, what is the possibility of a large-scale conflict between China and the United States? There are Americans who believe that only a conflict can restrain China economically and militarily. The possible point of conflict is obvious. It is not Central Asian region, as China and Russia have secured it for their influence, especially through Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India is unlikely to take on China. In any event, the context of Sino-Indian tensions is too narrow to give rise to a major conflict. You cannot have 10-foot waves in 1-foot deep water. The most likely region for Sino-US conflict is Taiwan and South China Sea. Formally, China will never renounce the possibility of use of force with regard to Taiwan. However, China must contemplate the consequences of such a military action. Ukraine offers a lesson. Any Chinese military action in Taiwan will pull the Far East and Southeast Asian countries together behind the United States, as Ukraine has brought Europe together behind that country, behind United States. That would be a nightmarish scenario from China's perspective. China can and must politically prevent Taiwan from taking any irresponsible steps. A military conflict would devastate Taiwan. The cooperative structures that bind China with the entire region and are key to regional prosperity would collapse with incalculable consequences which no Western intervention, however benign, can remedy. Conflict will serve no one's interest in the region. Realpolitik aside, the question that the United States must answer is what kind of world it would wish to help shape. Its legacy is already tainted by Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. The world is no longer a place for domination through occupation and assertion of naked force. The world is inexorably moving towards multipolarity and regionalization of power rather than its concentration towards a single pole. Pursuit of global hegemony may well be out of step with the spirits of time. The world also faces new challenges of climate change and environmental degradation, which demand cooperation and judicious use of resources. The American model of consumption is unsustainable, in my view. The world resources will be exhausted if its 8 billion people want to attain the American living standards. Lastly, what options for Pakistan? First, let us abandon the notion of our playing a role of a mediator or facilitator between the United States and China. This is delusional. 1970 was a different time. Now the two countries, that is China and United States, are directly engaged in myriad contexts. Options for our policy. We must, in my view, first of all, play with a straight bat. A country like ours cannot outsmart major powers. We only risk losing credibility. Our relations with China are of a strategic nature, and we cannot play games at their cost. China has stood by us in difficult times politically. China has surplus capital for investments in Pakistan. CPEC has been the single most important FDI activity in Pakistan in the recent years. For Pakistan, China provides the only available venue of advanced and sensitive technologies and of education in advanced sciences. In fact, because of our own shortcomings, we have not been able to take full advantage of our strong relations with China. Terrorism and extremism, mostly the result of our own misplaced policies, have also created an environment that discourages not just Chinese investments, but all investments, including domestic investments. We talk about corruption in contracts with Chinese private sector companies operating under CPEC arrangements. Should we not first blame ourselves for this situation? In fact, projects under defense and nuclear power generation sector with cooperation with China have been free from such problems and are implemented relatively smoothly. With the United States, we also desire good relations, but these must not be at the cost of our relations with any third country. If the United States demands that price, we must resist and explain, courteously but firmly, without any spin. That can help a healthy relationship of respect between the two countries. The dilemma in following a forthright and candid course in diplomacy, be it with the US or with China, often resides in our own minds. And I can give you many examples where we could have fine-tuned our narratives, particularly with regard to Afghan Taliban, with regard to even our nuclear program, Kargil, etc. But anyway, this is not the place for that. Concluding, I would say that first and foremost, we must develop, we must modernize our economy, our education, and every facet of our national activity. Modernization does not mean westernization. China is modernizing, but it is not westernizing. We should make that distinction. Secondly, I say that why should a primarily agricultural country with vast plains and water be importing wheat, cotton, pulses, edible oil that account for a hefty bill of close to $9 billion? Why can't we develop also cheaper alternatives in other areas, such as defense? Why not have anti-tank weapons rather than tanks? Why not have anti-aircraft missiles for our defense rather than have fighter aircrafts and so on? One thing is very clear. Begging for loans to pay back loans brings no respect even to a nuclear power. And also, we must learn responsible politics and value of ethics in political behavior. Our search for a magic foreign policy maneuver or outside props owes largely to lack of vision and our failure in having sound domestic policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have 15 minutes of question-answer session. Using the prerogative of the moderator, I would like to ask the first question. And my question is from Ambassador Robin Rafel. Ambassador Robin Rafel discussed the American Indo-Pacific strategy. And my question is, what are the expectations of the United States of America from Pakistan in the context of its Indo-Pacific strategy? Secondly, the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, which was announced earlier this year, lays a lot of emphasis on bolstering security in the Indo-Pacific. How does the United States of America implement or bolster security in the Indo-Pacific, whether it is in the shape of implementing the much debated Asian NATO that had been a concept that had been given by a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, or is it in the form of forming new military alliances in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gilani. Let me take the first question, the second question first, the idea of an Asian NATO. In my view, I think that's not where the U.S. is headed, and it's certainly not where they should be headed. I think what the U.S. is doing is developing a series of flexible, hopefully agile, what they call mini-laterals, these alliances, or these groupings that aren't really alliances, that don't have the obligations of alliances, like the Quad, like AUKUS, and so on. these small groupings that can come into play for certain aspects of the strategy in the Indo-Pacific, but not as an alliance. NATO, as everyone knows, there was a lot of debate about the expansion of NATO and taking on the responsibilities of the NATO alliance in a lot of countries who, to be honest, really weren't up to playing their part in NATO militarily. So I think that the idea of an alliance with the kinds of obligations that NATO has brought is not what the US is looking for in the Indo-Pacific, rather these more flexible groupings. And the second thing is, on Pakistan's role, I think in the US mind, to be candid, we haven't really quite figured that out. Clearly, I mentioned that in terms of the economic strategy, Pakistan's really the elephant in the room. It should be included in the economic strategy. And to the degree that the real goal of the Indo-Pacific strategy, although it sounds very military, and certainly the goal is to compete and establish a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's not really meant to. It's meant to bring stability and not conflict. And for Pakistan, I think as time goes by, the role will emerge. But in the meanwhile, I think for Pakistan, they should be building their relationships with the same countries that we've named as part of this strategy. And as things evolve, it will become clearer what roles people should play. And I also think that while the focus seems to be on the military side in the Indo-Pacific strategy and on the competition side, another part of it, and this seems a little bit inconsistent, is clearly the cooperation on the big issues, on climate, pandemics, and so on. And in that, Pakistan obviously has a key role, both in terms of informing the understanding of how you confront these challenges, and in working with others. So I think the role will become more obvious over time, as I think the Indo-Pacific strategy will broaden beyond the seeming military focus.
Thank you. Gentlemen on the third row, you raise your hands. Thank you.
Afternoon. My question is addressed to Madam Raffel. As you have yourself coined the Asia-Pacific into Indo-Pacific, now does someone in United States realize that as far as your Asia-Pacific's handling is concerned, you are putting most of your eggs in the Indian basket, and you are building up Indian capacity to an extent that tomorrow India is going to be a bigger challenge for you than China. And this is quite vivid from the Indian handling of Ukrainian crisis, where it has repeatedly defied United States.
May I say there are many people who wanted to ask questions, if you could be specific with regard to your question. So the gentleman's question is with regard to US putting all its eggs in Indian basket.
I think it's a misunderstanding of what the US is doing to say that we're putting all of our eggs in the Indian basket. I think there was a great deal of enthusiasm a few years ago to thinking that India might be an ally of the US in our competition with China, but I do think that it's become clear in recent years that the dominating theme in Indian foreign policy is still strategic autonomy. They do not want to join the US in a confrontation with China. They want to keep their options open. They view the world, they would like to see a world that is multipolar. They're very open and clear about that. So I think the US is getting wiser about what are realistic expectations from India and its relationship with India.
Ambassador Shahid Kiani, you have the floor.
India, because you are building up its capacity beyond certain limits, and tomorrow India is going to be bigger challenge for you than China. That was my question.
Ambassador Shahid Kiani.
My question is for Ambassador Rafael. I just heard your strategy U.S. strategy to contain China. But I think the policy, in my opinion, the U.S. policy is flawed in the sense that China and India know their limitations, the tyranny of geography and coexistence. You see what happened in the Ladakh standoff. Quickly, there was containing the standoff by China and India, and then their economic content has also enlarged. So it's not working. The policy is working because tyranny of geography and coexistence are two things that China and India know their limitations.
What's the question? What's the question? Sorry, I didn't understand what the question was.
The question, Ma, is that your strategy, the U.S. strategy is to contain, to push India to contain China. But unfortunately, the policy is flawed because they have not taken into account the tyranny of geography and the significance of coexistence. They have been able to, they know their limitations. The Ladakh standoff and quickly containing it and then enlarging the economic content.
Thank you. Again, I think what the U.S. was looking for as it has developed its strategic relationship with India is a partner in the competition with China that the U.S. sees that is clearly in now. And if there were a confrontation, which of course we all hope there wouldn't be, for help from India in that regard. But I agree with you, and this is part of our growing understanding of India's strategic autonomy in their foreign policy, that they're not going to become an ally of the U.S. against China, and that they are reaching out to Beijing and developing their own lines of communication and sorting out their border disputes and so on. So, I understand your point.
Thank you. Farhan Bukhari Saab, I saw you raising your hands. It's on its way.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador Jalani. This is a question for Ambassador Riaz Mohammad Khan Saab. Sir, given Pakistan's sliding economic conditions in recent years, and especially how those economic conditions have become, sliding economic conditions have become more pronounced with the destruction that's been caused by recent floods. Pakistan, for the future, will be depending much more on multilateral institutions where the US has very strong influence. We all know that. Do you think this is going to, in any way, weaken Pakistan's relationship with China? Because that is one of the fears which is being expressed by many people these days. Winding down of CPEC, to be precise, is what's being talked about. And maybe just very brief question for Ambassador Raffel, which is that, Madam, recently in Pakistan, President Biden's comments on Pakistan's nuclear program were widely noticed. Was this a simple off-the-cuff remark, not necessarily well thought out? Or does this suggest the beginning of a policy shift of some kind in Washington that Pakistan should be worried about? Thank you.
Should I answer?
You can.
Well, thank you, Jalil, for explaining the question to me. I am sorry, I have a problem with my hearing. You have said that we have economic relationship with the world, and that ought to increase. Would that impact on our relationship with China in the future? My answer is simple no to that. First of all, economic relationship with countries, whether it's China or it is Europe or it's United States or countries of the Middle East, they have their own dynamic, they ought to have their own dynamic. They should not be at the cost of each other. That in our own policy, we should be very clear, and we should make very clear if there are that kinds of demands. I have already explained that with China we have some very important aspects, very strategic aspects to our relationship which needs to be preserved, especially in terms of higher technologies, in terms of other strategic relations. So I personally do not think that our expanding relations with the United States or with the rest of the world should in any way diminish our relationship with China. And then, you know, this is not a question of dependence. We must learn to have an important relationship with every country for our own development, for the sake of our own development and advancement. That is the key. So the issues are basically at home, and they need to be addressed at home. The foreign policy must aid that process, rather than, you know, we should be thinking in terms of options, this country or that country. Thank you.
Just very quickly, the State Department has clarified the U.S. position on Pakistan's nuclear weapons. There's no new assessment or evaluation or concern, no new concern about the security of Pakistan's weapons. So I think there's nothing for Pakistan to be concerned about in that regard.
My question is to Ambassador Robin Raphael. Wars and conflicts are the fuel for security industrial complex. World War I, II, NATO, Cold War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, Libya, Syria, and now Ukraine are some of the examples of the recent history. Will United States continue to thrive on security industrial complex, or it has any plans to change its economic generation to some other resource? Thank you.
Okay. Now I understand the question. Two things. One, it's absolutely true that there's a military-industrial complex in the United States, and it's getting a huge amount of help right now from the war in Ukraine. But in terms of the Indo-Pacific, I think you could, I hope, tell from my remarks that the economic side of this and the Indo-Pacific economic framework is not yet well defined. And critics of the strategy have said, you know, you really need to focus, and I agree with the critics in that sense, you really need to focus on the economic side of this, because that's what's of concern to the countries that you've identified as partners. So I don't see the Indo-Pacific region as the new greenfield for the so-called military-industrial complex, by which we mean the arms salespeople and the contractors and so on and so forth. You know, the focus really needs to be on developing the economic component of it.
The gentleman at the back.
Good afternoon. I'm Ali Jabir, environmental and defense journalist from...
Can you speak a little louder?
Sir,
Because
I'll try, sir. I'm Ali Jabir, environmental and defense journalist from APP. I had a general question to the panelists that if the US strategy in the Indo-Pacific continues to pursue its ambition of containing China and promoting the hegemonic India, and if any major conflict appears in this region, in the South Asia region, will the US and the West able to survive the aftershocks of that conflict? As in the previous GSTAR, Ambassador Cameron Munter told us that the US has shifted its focus from the Middle East to the Asia Pacific. If this is that shift, or if this is that strategy, will they be able to survive the economic and other aftershocks of any mega conflict in the region? Thank you.
Well, the idea of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to reestablish a sort of balance of power there to deter and ensure that there isn't any conflict. The American strategist felt, and with a certain correctness, that they'd taken their eye off the ball in the Indo-Pacific, and things had gotten a bit out of balance from the US point of view. So the idea is to recreate a stable balance there so that there is not any conflict. That is really the goal.
Sir.
My question pertains to the Ukraine war. If we look at the cost of the war, one report which I read, the global cost has shot up to as much as $8 to $9 trillion. This report was published when I saw it in the United States. And as far as the region is concerned, the entire world is affected because of the Ukraine war, including Pakistan. My point is that this war started because Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO, duly supported by the West, of course, by the United States. Russia has applied the law of preemption because they feel that by becoming member of NATO, it will create the same situation it was created in the Bay of Pigs during Kennedy's period. They would not like to be strangulated by a country which is nuclear, become member of NATO, stops their sea lines of communication, and Russia feels threatened from this particular paradigm.
Thank you, sir.
Now, my only question now from here is that United States, if it wants, it can prevent a war. It can tell Ukraine not to become a member of NATO, and Ukraine can remain a neutral state, where everyone enjoys the situation which existed before this war.
Thank you. Thank you. Ukraine, yes. by not insisting Ukraine becoming a member of NATO or the UN.
Sorry, I think you're making a point that many people have made to us, and there's a big debate in the US and people writing about the whole issue of how much the expansion of NATO affected the Russian decision to invade Ukraine and so on and so forth. So it's a point of great discussion. I would simply say, in my own personal view, that the US as well as Russia miscalculated in the run-up to this war. Obviously, Russia miscalculated, and this has been, I think, a strategic disaster for them in many ways. But the US, I think, did not fully appreciate the degree of concern of Russia about the expansion of NATO, and believed that the threat of very severe sanctions, which indeed we implemented, would put Russia off. And as it turned out, that didn't work. So I think both sides are recalculating. Certainly the US side is looking to see how restraint can be brought to this whole conflict. and when and where you could start some kind of negotiation and so on. But your point about NATO, I think, is well taken, and a lot of people believe that that was one of the primary motives. I mean, I think there were other motives as well about Putin's ambitions, but I think we've learned a lesson from this.
Thank you. The second last question goes to Air Marshal Ashfaq Arai, and then followed by this lady at the back. Thank you.
My question is to Ambassador Ravin. Ambassador, you mentioned in your remarks also and in one of the answers also that the US is only attempting a rebalancing act. But if we look at the history of US balancing acts in the past, the regions have gone into turmoil for a long period. So do we expect it again?
Could you repeat the question? Do you expect?
Ma'am just referred twice that the US is only attempting rebalancing in the Indo-Pacific. So if we look at the history of US balancing acts in the past, the regions remained in turmoil for a long time. Even if we look at Afghanistan, Iraq or whatever. So
US has been already involved in Asia Pacific, Afghanistan, Iran.
I'm not sure I fully understood your question, but again, a couple of things. One, in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, the way the U.S. looks at the globe, those are more part of the Middle East and Southwest Asia. And it was that focus that drew us away from the idea of quote-unquote pivoting to Asia and paying more attention to that part of the world, which again will be the economic powerhouse of the 21st century. So those wars are exactly what we were trying to walk away from to focus on this other area of the world, which we believe is more important.
Yes. The lady at the back. And this is the last question, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon to the panelists. My question could be answered by anyone. Since we have seen that there are strategies being developed in the bloc of South Asia, but there is one consequence that is attached with these strategies, that is the upcoming war of narratives. Pakistan has a defensive narrative in the worldwide because we know that our economic conditions cannot afford an offensive strategy. But still, we deal a huge amount of consequences regarding the narrative that Pakistan is not a state that wants to secure peace and stability. And we have been facing a lot of troubles regarding the war in terrorism. So what, in your opinion, can we do, or what technological advancement could help in building the positive narrative of Pakistan? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, because I think it really is an important one. And a lot of think tanks like this one in Washington, D.C. have been, in the wake of the end of the Afghan war, or the U.S. withdrawal of its troops from Afghanistan, have been thinking about how do we sort of reset the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan, which over the years has been up and down. Everybody knows the history. And I think one important element to that was something that Ambassador Riaz Khan said, which was Pakistan and the U.S. both need to be more candid and direct in their diplomatic exchanges. Be more realistic, have realistic expectations, and of course, have discipline in your rhetoric and so on and so forth. I have always said, for many, many years that I've been involved in this region, that the U.S. cannot afford to ignore a country like Pakistan, with its population, its resources, its entrepreneurial talent, its location, its army, its nuclear weapons, all these sorts of things, a huge list of assets that Pakistan has. And as a global power, the United States needs to figure out how to deal with Pakistan. By the same token, Pakistan needs to be realistic about expectations from the U.S., and as we've been speaking about the Indo-Pacific, that's now a big focus of attention for the U.S., and everybody has limited bandwidth. But I think both sides need to be realistic and talk honestly to one another. I think this is a good time for that. We have a new ambassador here, whom I'm sure you all realize has been traveling around and coming to understand the country and figuring out how to develop the commonalities on which we can work together in ways that we have in the past and some new ways, especially in the economic sphere.
Thank you so much. Our profound gratitude to all the three distinguished panelists, Professor Dr. Yan Shutong, Ambassador Robin Riffel, and Ambassador Riaz Mohammad Khan Sahab. I think they have done full justice to the topics which had been assigned to them, and which were comprehensively covered by all of them. And our special thanks to all of you who raised very, very pertinent questions to all the panelists. And I would now request a huge round of applause for the three panelists by the
Thank you, sir. It is now the presentation. We will now present the GSTAR mementos to our distinguished speakers. I would request President Cass to please present GSTAR souvenirs to our speakers. I would first request Ambassador Robin Raphael to please receive her memento. Yes. Right. Yes, sir. I would request Ambassador Riaz Mohammad Khan to please receive his GSTAR souvenir. The GSTAR souvenir of our online speaker, Professor Yon Choi Twing, will be received by Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jilani and will be delivered to the Beijing Embassy. I would now request President Cass, Advisor Foreign Affairs Cass, and the speakers for a group photograph. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the first session of GSTAR 2022. I thank the distinguished speakers and the esteemed audience for joining us today. I request you all to exit from the left side of the hall for lunch. Lunch will be served in front of Pefwa Home Store.